Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Sounds good.
Okay, good. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the meaning of home. Home for me was, when I was growing up on the island, was Trinidad and Tobago, of course, where my navel string was buried, what we call your afterbirth, was buried, and my great grandmother was buried, and my great grandfather was buried, and my parents are buried. And I had all this emotion that I built up about this place where I could never be turned away. And this was home to me. And I had no question about if I can find home in a different place until I started talking to my great grandmother, Julia, who was born on the island of Martinique. And I'm going to start with a little bit of that and where the whole notion of home, where it first started. At 7:50 a.m., the people of St. Pierre, Martinique were just getting ready for the day. Martinique is one of the Windward Islands and continues to this day to be an overseas region of France. It was Thursday morning in the year of 1902 when the men and women on bicycles could be seen making their way to the sugarcane factory, the main employer. Horse-drawn carts jostled for space along the narrowly cobblestone roads. Farmers were getting ready to lay out fruits and vegetables for sale in the open-air markets or along the roadway. Fishermen were on their way to the docks to unload the catch from the night before. In every kitchen, mothers were bending over kerosene stoves, preparing the first meal of the day. This constituted a freshly brewed local coffee, and in every yard in front or at the back of a house could be seen recently picked red coffee beans, which were harvested and laid out to dry in the sun. The coffee trees from which these were gathered grew for many years in the valleys. They were shaded by lofty immortal trees. On this morning, cocoa tea was being prepared by grating the dried cocoa pod and collecting the contents. This powder was added to water and allowed to simmer on the stove to a rich brown consistency. A dash of allspice was further added to the liquid and sipped for half an hour or so. Then there were the fried bakes to go with saltfish bulgjal, which was seasoned with tomatoes, onions, hot peppers, and coconut oil. Sulking boys and girls as they dressed for school were hastened on by grandmothers. Fathers set out for a day's work armed with thermos and brown paper bags with their morning meal. Elderly men and women could be seen sitting out in the sun or strolling along the water's edge, as St. Pierre is a coastal town. Julia was being transported by tram car back to the capital city of Fort-de-France after she had spent a night home visiting her family. She worked with a French émigré couple as nanny to their 3-year-old. The temperature, as usual, was in the mid-70s or maybe a little hotter, but nothing to be concerned about. Suddenly, and without any visible signs, the volcano erupted. The eruption of Mount Pelee in Martinique continues to baffle volcanologists to this day concerning the lack of warning. The pyroclastic flowed at a rate of 2 miles a minute, destroying the town of 30,000 people, killing everyone except 2, a convict and a shoemaker. The convict was in a poorly ventilated dungeon-like cell. The shoemaker jumped into the sea. Julia escaped the eruption, but her immediate family of 3 brothers and both parents died that day. She was 18 at the time. The next day, she, a lone orphan, was dispatched by the authorities to a boat leaving for Trinidad to work with a family from England, while her employer returned to France. In Trinidad, she spoke a French Creole patois in a country that was occupied by Britain, where most people spoke English or a version of it. The family she worked for taught her English, which she found difficult. Over the years, she was servant to several other families before she finally set up a roti shop in the city of Port of Spain, from which she was able to make a living. Julia was my great grandmother. While growing up, I would visit her often. She lived with her daughter, my maternal grandmother, after she stopped working. Often, she talked about the home she had left behind, especially in the autumn of her years. She habitually spoke about the time of the eruption and the loss of her family and friends. She recalled the period in the early days when she arrived in Trinidad and of how isolated and lonely she felt, being away from Martinique, her homeland, where her parents were buried with the rest of her family. She talked about the loss of her language and her culture. Then after about 50 years, when she could afford it, she returned to Martinique for the first time since leaving. The shock and sadness she experienced upon revisiting the place of her birth affected her so deeply, she refused to go back on a second visit. The changes she had witnessed were colossal. Or maybe it was she who had changed, she was not sure. The image of home for her, which she harbored in her mind all those years, was illusory, a myth. A whole new generation had emerged with different ideas and values. St. Pierre was rebuilt. Nothing remained of the old city. Again, she felt isolated and detached. The past that she knew was sequestered out of view from her memory. Her trip had been about reclaiming the feeling of home, but all to no avail. She returned to Trinidad crestfallen and complaining about how the world had passed her by. She wanted to know where home was for her, an émigré. Was it the here where she now resided and raised a family, or a there, a place of the past that she could not recognize? Could there be two places she could recognize as homeland? Firstly, was home the place where she could obtain a birth certificate even though she no longer lived there? Secondly, was home the place where she could live and was able to obtain a marriage license? Julia died at the age of 80. I have kept her experience constantly before me for many years now, especially during the times when I travel from the here to the there and everywhere else, with the hope that I can understand her inquiry of what and where is home for the émigré. Is it the place where my umbilical cord is buried, or is it the place where I now reside, where I enjoy a community of friends and where my work with young people is so fulfilling? Can there be more than one place to call home, where I can lay my head in comfort and safety? And so that is the preamble to which I base my search for the meaning of home, because when I came into the United States to study at the master's level, I had all intention of returning to Trinidad, but one thing led to another. I want to go on a little bit to talk about this whole search. Page 7. While living on the island, I'm skipping around, I felt I knew the meaning of home and homeland. Home was invested with feelings for family, for friends and traditions. and a place where I could always be welcome. Homeland, on the other hand, was the country where I was born and the only place where I could obtain a birth certificate. It was also where I first learned a language and culture that identify me as a woman of Trinidad. I wondered if I could experience the feeling of home elsewhere. Can it be shared? Can the idea of homeland be associated with other categories besides birthright? When one becomes a naturalized citizen of a country, does that country become homeland as well? Furthermore, can homeland be shared? Those early days working on my degree was also a time when I thought constantly of my life in Trinidad and how it contributed to my notion of home. I'm going to skip around a little again. I have my stuff set out here. I'm going to go to page 13 and stop a little bit. So I'm going to talk about arriving in the United States and some of my observations. 32 years ago, my first entry into my newly acquired passport was stamped July the 14th, 1988. I was leaving home for the first time. I felt that the time was ripe for a new adventure. Deciding whether to pursue studies either in Jamaica or the United States, I chose the United States, since Jamaica was so similar in manners and customs to that of my home in Trinidad. I yearned for a new experience. I like to think of my passport as a kind of journal, episodic. It is a silent, unwritten story with each date representing a fragment of a personal narrative of arrival and departure. Upon leaving home, this would be a maiden voyage taking place in the wee hours of the morning. I boarded a red-eye flight to New York, arriving at dawn. I have yet to witness such a sunrise as the one that welcomed me that morning. The rays of the sun penetrating through the clouds created a landscape that was surreal and alien. Orange, magenta, green, blue, black, white, the colors of the rainbow welcomed me. It appeared as a tableau painted by an impatient artist to represent chaos, foreshadowing what would transpire as I set foot on foreign soil. I'm going to skip around again. I'm going to talk a little bit about now I was I had arrived in New York, and I had a little bit of problem with my reservation. Some of you who have read the book discovered, and I'm not going to go through the altercation between the taxi driver and myself, who drove off with my bags because I did not, he did not, he forgot to, I did not take my bag out of the back of the car, but I did have my pocketbook. But I'm going to skip that and talk a little bit about myself being in the hotel and looking at the snow falling. I thought that was something that you may enjoy. Page 13. So, once I settled in my room, I witnessed snow falling for the first time. I was looking through the window of my hotel room when it started. It was beautiful. I was amazed at how rapidly it accumulated. It covered any and everything: rooftops, windowsills, cars, trees, fences, and people. The plows were working frantically. They backed it into cul-de-sac, piled it high on mounds, moved it against retaining wall wherever they could find space. They tried to sequester it out of view behind tall hedges. Snow was everywhere. The winter landscape was so unlike the lush, verdant palette of the tropical garden I was familiar with. Winter had painted a garden of a different nature, with trees as stark and bare, so that from where I was standing, I could make out every feature of the landscape, every ridge and hollow. The starkness laying bare the trees, branches, and twigs. This frozen world was not totally white, but had a palette of green, pale greens and blues and grays. As I stood there, taking it all in from the 6th floor of my hotel room, I forgot about the lost luggage and the brazen cop. I did have a bit of an altercation between a cop, so I don't know. David probably remember that. I know Carla Jean read it as well. So I'm going to skip around a bit and get on to page 13. Now, from New York, I was destined to go to a little town in Western Pennsylvania, which is called Clarion, where I was enrolled to do my master's degree in library science. So the next stop on my journey was a college in Western Pennsylvania on a predominantly white campus in a small town with the ubiquitous Main Street. Arrangements were made through the International Student Office for me to rent a trailer from which was situated off campus. It was owned by two women in their mid-60s. They were very gracious to me during the time I was a tenant. They referred to me always as the colored girl, not the woman of color or the Black woman. Strangely, I have never seen colored as a designation of race and ethnicity whenever I fill out forms in the United States. It was my first encounter into the United States with people who live below the poverty line. Unwittingly, I became a member of a trailer park community. That first winter, I developed a curious way of walking, as if I were treading on eggshells, while everyone around me seemed comfortable, hustling from one place to the other. I inched along, slipping and sliding. I felt embarrassed whenever I saw children playing in the snow. Their incredible adaptability in freezing temperatures, tunneling through mounds of snow in their make-believe world of igloos and caves was frankly amazing. I was envious of their casual indifference to the cold and ice. Someone suggested I should buy shoes with ridges on the bottom. That did not help much either. During those early days, I was not my usual effervescent self. I forced myself to think of creative ways to be transported out of the abysmal cold and freezing temperature. I found some comfort in the one thing that had gained primacy in my mind ever since my arrival. I thought of home constantly. On those occasions when I thought of home, I was often reminded of the hot midday sun. I imagined myself on the beach looking out into the placid turquoise water with an occasional break of shimmering highlights of speckled silver. I thought of colors, mostly yellow and green. I thought of fruits and flowers. I thought of the Trinidadian artist M.P. Aladdin's paintings of colorful streets and village scenes. His rural settings were folksy and pleasant. I pictured Leroy Clark's magnificent landscapes and abstract works with a profusion of color, flamboyant and zestful, with a deep sensitivity. I thought of my favorite foods. there was no comfort in campus cuisine. I thought of the big Creole extravaganza for which Trinidad is famous. There was an alluring vision of myself in my mind's eye, of myself in costume as the Queen of the Nile, resplendent on Carnival Day. And so I will stop for a minute and ask folks if they have questions. But of course, it goes on, and it is resolved in the end. I think creditably, it is resolved in such a way that I was able to find home in both places. Any questions?
Gemma, I really appreciate your reading this and have really enjoyed reading the book. Maybe not a question so much about the contents in your story, but more about how you discovered what you've written about, right? I know that it sounded like from the prologue that this came about during the pandemic, that you wanted to write your story. Was there a lot of introspection that had to happen to come up with, or to, really figure out what you wanted to write about? Or are these things that you had really felt and dealt with all along, and then it was just more about getting it on paper?
Yes, it was, I would say, it started when I was a student, the nostalgia. And along with the nostalgia was the recollection of those conversations with my great grandmother. And of course, it continued throughout my, especially the time when I was doing my master's degree. But slowly I began to find meaning in the small community on campus that embraced me. And the students, when I was employed by the university, working with young people and sharing with them the lessons that I had learned growing up on an island where my parents were poor, blue collar. My father was a blue collar worker, as the case may be. But of course, it was heightened in recent times by what I was observing at the borders of countries like United States and countries in Europe like Germany and France and Spain, where you have people who were leaving their homes and appearing at borders of countries that they probably knew very little about. And I wondered about how they were going to be able to reconcile this whole meaning of home, if they would ever be able to transport all that emotional content from the place where they were born. Sometimes they were evicted, they had to leave, and it was not always the kind of migration that I experienced. I did not experience a forced migration. I came in to do a course of study and with the intention of leaving, but there are many people who are on these borders who leave because they're looking for a better life for themselves and their children. And are they going to be able to bring some of that feeling of home to these new places? So, and there's a lot of that today in the literature. And I did quite a bit of research to write this book, even though it's kind of like a conversational style, but a lot of my, the articles I was reading talked about the search for home. So I said, well, it was not a forced exile for me. So why don't I look at it from the perspective of a person who came in voluntarily and with all good intentions of returning. But at the same time, I wanted to let people know that a lot of us who come in, we are not here to always take. And sometimes what we suffer emotionally and the loss of our homes far outweigh what we are able to gain in terms of opportunities. So it's not always a zero-sum game where the loss and the gains cancel out each other. To be able to live in the United States, some of us have, we've lost a lot, you see, in order to stay. But it is the place where we have to, because of, like in the case of forced exile, where it is better for our family and for us at the same time, politically and otherwise. I hope that answers your question, David.
It did. Thanks, Gemma.
Yeah. Carla, do you have a question? I think she wants to unmute you. If you want to unmute, can you unmute Carla and John?
I'm going to unmute everyone, and please.
Yeah, we can unmute everyone. Yes.
Yeah, we can just unmute everyone now, and then.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are unmuted, Carla Jean. I can hear you. Hi.
Okay. What I was thinking when you were saying that was that had you landed in another part of the United States that was similar to your homeland, say Florida or even parts of California, would the transition have been any easier, you think? Or was it just, it would have been rough anyway, you did it?
I think it would have been easier because the snow really shocked me. I was actually looking through the window of this hotel. I was on the 6th floor, and I could not understand why people were walking in what looked like heavy rain, bareheaded. And I was like, oh my God, I've landed in a place where people are not all sane. And then I noticed it started accumulating. And then I noticed all these trucks and these, the plows, and they were pushing this thing. I was like, oh my God, this is snow. Can you imagine somebody who's coming into these United States for the first time and seeing snow? It is a shock. It was beautiful. The whole thing was beautiful. And then the whole place was just covered.
Yeah. It reminds me when I lived in North Carolina, and I'm used to snow from Pittsburgh, and they very seldom had snow. In fact, there are people who lived there for 15 or 20 years and had never seen snow. And we had what Pittsburgh would call a dusting, like maybe 2 inches, and these people lost their minds. I mean, they were going buying snow tires, and you don't need snow tires on a level place, but it was sort of like that. It was just the reverse of what you were, experiencing, and where these people had lived there all the time. And then when the snow came, it was so odd for them. And people were actually getting snowballs and putting in their freezer and keeping them so they could bring them out when the snow was gone. I thought that was funny. We just want to get rid of snow up here, period. But they were saving it, sticking it in the deep freeze, and they would pull it out in the summer and have snowball fights, But it's culture shock, and it's physical shock. I mean, it's different.
Yes.
Right? I could understand how you feel different about it.
Yes, and just the moving around, just getting around. I could not believe it. I was seeing people running on this thing, and I was just slipping and sliding all over the place, and very embarrassed,
You didn't have the proper clothing too. I mean, the shoes and
Yes, never had the proper clothing because as a student you can't afford very expensive coats, So yeah. I
was
also
gonna,
go ahead.
I was going to say I have a great admiration for immigrants. I'm from an immigrant family.
Yes.
My father and mother came from Ireland, and it was forced immigration. They lived at the time of Winston Churchill and the time of the partition of Ireland.
Yes.
And of my father, of 9 siblings, 7 came to the United States. And I think it takes a great deal of courage. And the other thing is the part that they left in Ireland is a beautiful place at Killarney, where people go there as a tourist site. And you always say, as an immigrant, why would anybody want to leave a beautiful place like this? But the reason you had to leave because you had to. You couldn't work. There was no work for people. And the greatest thing in Ireland was their biggest export was people until recently. So I just admire that. There was an Indian fellow I worked with in New York when I worked. And I remember, I can't think where part of India he came from, but he was like, he left, he came to New York, it was like 90 degrees in India, and he arrived and it's like 20 degrees or 5 above zero or something. I mean, it must be quite a shock.
Oh, I'm sure it was. I want to say something about the language. I want to read something about the language and how I struggled with it. Um, um, with arrival to any new country, there is a definite period of adjustment. One must first wade through a sea of cultural norms that are uncommon. For me, language posed the first hurdle. I had left an English-speaking country to study in another country where English was the first language. When I decided to study in the United States, I did not anticipate problems with communication. I was used to an easygoing, colloquial, everyday form of expression at home with words and phrases unique to Trinidadians. Fortunately, I could communicate when it was necessary in textbook style English. I soon discovered, however, that my difficulty with communicating was not with the syntax of the language itself, but with phonetics. The way I pronounce words was uncommon and foreign to people with whom I interacted. My twang confused them. The conversational style I knew and was accustomed to with its rhythmical inflections and accentuated phonetic patterns on words and phrases colored my diction and the way I expressed myself. It was unintelligible to the average person. To further complicate matters, I discovered that many of the people in the area, that is in Clarion, that is, also had a form of dialect that was regional. Often I too had difficulty understanding it. And this is something that I struggled with. In the first place, I was told to slow down. I don't know how many of you have been to the Caribbean. We have a tendency to talk very fast. And Jamaicans talk very fast. The Barbadians probably a little slow, but Trinidadians talk very fast. And my husband, as you know, Calvin Stemley, has had to, on many occasions, slow down, I can't understand you. However, so the way I emphasize on certain syllables when I speak, the way I put stress on certain words also had to change. And I find that slowly I was beginning to sound not exactly like the way we speak in Trinidad. So that when I go back to Trinidad, people look at me and they listen to me and they say, "You are not from here." And I said, "Yes, I am from here." But when I'm in the United States, people said, "Where are you from?" Because you obviously are not from here. You speak English very well, but what island are you from? So I'm not from here in the land of my birth. I'm not from here in the land where I live. So sometimes I feel I live in some kind of a limbo. I'm in limbo. I'm in the space between. So this is the reality of a lot of us who have an accent. When we go back, because I was talking to a group of Caribbean women from one of the Caribbean book clubs, and she said that she had a similar experience. She's always has a similar experience whenever she's in Barbados. Barbadians say, "You're from here." And she said, "I'm just as from here as you are." "No, you don't sound like you're from here." But here in the United States, it's the same thing. So it's interesting. You know, like John, I don't know if you if your family has had a similar kind of experience, because folks from, did you say Ireland or
Yes,
Wales?
Ireland, yes.
Yeah, they have a really
They have an accent also.
pronounced.
Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, they never, my parents never got rid of the accent. They've always had it. Sometimes when young kids, I met young immigrant kids that, like, I was where I lived, there was a young Turkish kid that came here, and he lived in Germany and he came here. And after a year or two here, he was like he was 6 or 7 when I got to know him. He was like an American kid. He had all the slang and everything. It seemed much easier for him than his mother. His mother, who was from Turkey and Germany, she had an accent. She had a German accent. She spoke English very well, but for a while she had difficulty with it, you know.
You know, it's funny. It depends on where you're at in the United States. Like I said, I lived in North Carolina, and they thought I talked funny. And when I went to San Francisco, I was talking to someone. They said, "Oh, you're from Pittsburgh." I said, "Yeah."
Pittsburgh, yeah.
They said, "How do you know?" I said, "Well, your accent." I'm like, I didn't know I had an accent. But you know, to different people, different places. You know, like I said, they knew right away, you know, that I wasn't from that particular state. I was American, but I wasn't, you know, from that area. And just the other day, I was saying I was going to wash some clothes, and they were, my friend was cracking up. He said, "What you going to do to those clothes?" I said, "I'm going to wash them." And they said, "No, it's wash."
Wash.
And he's from down south, you know, and he has a draw, and I started laughing. I said, "If the pot isn't called a kettle black, I don't know what that is." You know?
The strange thing is, I cannot tell the variation in accents from among people from different parts of the United States. I can't discern the, you know, the difference. So like somebody from the South,
Yeah.
you know, when I'm in Trinidad, I know the person is an American with, you know, the drawl, what I call a drawl, you know. Americans talk with a kind of drawl. Hey man, drawly drawl thing. So we know, we say, we call Americans Yankees. Every American is a Yankee because, you know, the Yankee this and the Yankee that. So strangely enough, I can't tell like Americans can. I can't tell a person is from New York. New Yorkers do have a strange twang though. They really do. Yeah. But from, you know, say from Ohio.
New Yorkers talk very fast.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a very fast pace there if you live in New York. And for the South, I always felt the South, there was a slower pace and the language was drawn out. And the Caribbean people, I met people from the islands, Jamaican places, their accent sounds very musical to me. It's, you know, there's something about it, you know. There was one fella I remember, he was the president of Jamaica, and I saw him on television a number of times years ago, Michael Manley. I thought he had a beautiful accent. Just listening to him speak, it was just wonderful, you know.
The other thing I want to raise is this question of the pull that we seem to have, some of us who have been born in a different state. I was talking to my girlfriend today, and she's from Alabama, and she says, "You know, Gemma, I feel I want to go home. I feel like I need to, I get this feeling that sometimes I need to go home, to go back to Alabama." And I remember my grandmother always talk about the homing instinct, this pull, the homing instinct, you know, the salmon that fights its way upstream to spawn, and the birds that migrate to that place where they can lay their eggs and raise their young, but the young always comes back to the place where they were born. And I did write a poem about it. The poem, part of it is the last poem in the book. The book also has some poems that I've written, but I want to read a little bit of that to you so that it could generate some discussion around how you feel about this homing instinct, where maybe you were born in a different place, a different tongue, how you have a tendency to want to go back. So here it goes. A place I know draws me back fervently to where my navel string is buried and the ancestors are entombed. There I once took those first steps tentatively. I know my home by the imprint of those first steps in the sand. The shape pulls me back often from distant places where I choose to nest for a while. What is this homing instinct, this innate sense that pulls, whereby the pigeon harks back to its roost and where the salmon defies all odds to return to spawn? What is this homing instinct? Does it ever melt away like the fallen snow or dissipates like an echo in the night? Does it fade like the stars of dawn or melt like the dewdrops on a blade of grass? Maybe it is like the ebb and flow of the riptide, never ceasing, or the mystery of the setting sun that rises again without fail. It draws me home. And sometimes I just know I have to get home. I want to go home, you know, especially around Christmas and the carnival. I just know I have to get home. I have to get out. I have to get home. It's a very uneasy feeling. So, any takers?
You know, my grandmother Martin was born and raised and lived her whole life in West Virginia. She was my mother's mother. And she got sick and she came to live with us. She lived with us for about a year. And I loved it. You know, she was like really wise and she told us stories of, you know, going to school barefoot and all that kind of stuff. And she was sick and she knew that her end was near. And she kept talking about going home. I have to go home. And so people said, well, maybe she's just, you know, having dementia and she's already home. I said, no, I think it's something, a different home, you know, and she just wanted to go back to West Virginia, even though it wasn't the same because they built a big DuPont plant there after she left and they sort of took over the whole valley, you know, and the little spot where she was actually wasn't there anymore. We did have relatives, you know, still back there, that places that she knew, but the place that she grew up in didn't exist. But she wasn't happy until, you know, she got back there. And I guess she was there not that long and then she passed away. But my mother said that, you know, it was best to take, my mother took her back and she said it was best to take her back because there was that part of her that belonged there. And she wanted to be buried there, which she is. And that when she knew that her time was up, that she would have been content just staying up here, you know, and it would have been cruel to keep her here, you know. So there's something that wasn't that far away. You know, West Virginia is not that far away, but
No,
it was her home. It was a different way of living. It was a different, you know.
yes, that it's a kind of strange kind of pull. I just know that I cannot be away too long, you know. Normally I go back once a year. But because of COVID, I have not been back for 2 years.
Yeah.
But I always know when it was time to go. I just take up myself and, you know, arrange a flight.
And when you go, Gemma, is like, I don't experience that feeling. So I'm curious, when you go and to kind of satisfy that need, right? Does the duration of time you stay there matter?
No, that's a very interesting question, David, because I normally stay for at least 14 days, but then I start to feel very antsy. I have to get back. I
So
cannot
that's
stay.
home.
Yes, I cannot stay for a month or so. I can stay for 2 weeks, and especially if I go with my husband. Yes,
Sure.
he doesn't like long stays. So sometimes I don't go with my husband. Um, I don't always do it because it's a bonding time with my sister. I have a sister who lives down there and her children, her husband as well. Husband works at the university, but it is it is not a relaxing time always. When my husband goes with me, my husband is an American. When my husband goes with me, my husband wants to see places and do touristy things. But that's not what I do. I want to be with my family. I want to hear all the problems. I have to be involved in resolution and helping to put out some fires, that sort of stuff. And so it is not always convenient to take my husband because it's two different mindsets, you know. So but there comes a time when I have to leave, when I want to leave, when I want to get back because I have two homes. And I talk about how I experience these two homes because that is the way I was able to resolve this split and to avoid this feeling. I had a fear that at some point I may think the United States is more of a home to me because I was married to someone who was born in the United States. And I was fearful that, I worried whether I would begin to think that this place where I live now is more important to me than that place where I was born. But I discover over the years as I visit Trinidad that I experience Trinidad differently. When I'm in Trinidad, the food and the flowers and the culture, the calypso and the steel band and the people and the rivers and the landscape I feel it differently. It's a completely different feeling. And when I'm in the United States, I don't experience it in the same way. So I think to myself, it is two different ways of experiencing home so that it is not a conflict to me, you see. And that is the way in which I've been able to think of home as planting a set of roots in two different places that tend to nourish each other. I'm getting into the spiritual realm now. This notion of the tree of life, where you have two sets of roots, two branches of the trunk of a tree, the tree of life, with two one trunk, but roots that spread in two places that tend to nourish each other. So I think of it that way then. That is the metaphor that I use in order to help me to understand and resolve the notion of home, the meaning of home.